You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. We are talking to Matt Kibbe, who is the president and CEO of FreedomWorks. FreedomWorks has over 1 million Facebook fans, in fact, millions of members and followers. He's an economist by training, and he's very, very focused on tax reform. Matt, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks, Doug.
I'd like to start with a question regarding the flat tax, which is something you talk a lot about. Could you just explain what that is?
Well, the idea behind fundamental tax reform, and specifically the flat tax, is to get rid of all the special favors, all of the carved out deductions and loopholes and credits, and replace it with one simple, low, flat, fair rate. And this is a concept that was developed by Alvin Rabushka at the Hoover Institute, probably in the late 80s, early 1990s, has been pursued as legislation. But the idea is that so much complexity in the tax code both impedes economic growth, discourages work, and really creates a corrupt politicization of what should be a very simple process of collecting the revenue that government needs to function properly, but also limiting the amount of revenue that the government collects to its proper functions.
It seems to me that a flat tax, the problems you're describing, corruption or just too many rules and regulations, it's not a question of what type of tax you have. It's just a question of how the government likes to do things, no?
Yeah, and I think if you go to the halls of the Ways and Means Committee here, where tax policy is written, or the Senate Finance Committee, you discover that various interest groups, corporations, unions across the ideological spectrum, they love to show up and try to get something special from that committee. And there's almost an inherent corruption in that process, because they write the checks to the legislators who need that money for their reelection. In exchange, they have special access. And what the flat tax does is it takes away that incentive to get something special and replaces it with an incentive to produce better products, to invest more in the economy, to create jobs. And that's what we're trying to get at with tax reform. It's a notion of fairness that I think is very embedded in certainly in U.S. culture. And that's the idea that everyone should be treated exactly like everybody else.
Mm-hmm. So the example would be a flat tax. If someone earns $100,000, he would pay, let's say, $20,000 in tax, and the person who earns $1 million would pay $200,000 in tax?
Essentially, and there's the way it's structured is a proper flat tax literally can be filled out on a postcard, and there's an individual version of that postcard and there's a corporation version of that postcard. But the idea is a basic deduction for individuals and families, so that poor folks and people that really don't reach that threshold don't pay income tax on their first dollar. But above that, everybody pays the same rates. Corporations pay once, individuals pay once, and the idea is to tax income only once and to never double tax if that person decides to take their income and invest it in capital and invest it in job creation. And I think that's one of the things that upsets the left, because they have this very different notion of fairness, this idea that wealth creation per se should be punished. And our idea is that the rich are rich. They're rich under every single tax code. They know how to exploit tax loopholes. They know how to hire lawyers. But in a system where everybody is treated exactly the same, it's always the case that the opportunity comes to those who aren't already rich. If you punish wealth creation, no one can get there.
So I presume that you are excluding dividend, interest, and capital gains as taxable income?
Yes.
Okay, so let's now talk about some of the more famous cases that people like to discuss. The ultra-rich families, right? The founders of Walmart and the like, who didn't really work. They're billionaires, and they inherited a lot of this money. At what point does some of that go back to the society?
Well, the idea is that if they aren't investing that, if they aren't building new capital, if they aren't building new um, opportunities, they're taking it as income or they're losing it. There's money does not sit. It either is drawn as income, it's spent, and that obviously is taxed in our society. But more importantly, you want to incentivize people that will put that money back into the economy. And instead, today, you find a lot of capital that sits on the sidelines because no one wants to be taxed twice. It goes offshore, it sits, it doesn't lend to productivity. And that's a particular problem here in the United States, where our tax rules, our regulatory rules are incentivizing people to sit on the money. And this doesn't hurt the rich, it hurts the rest of us.
Mm-hmm. We are talking to Matt Kibbe, who's in charge of an organization called FreedomWorks. He's an economist by training. He's also a very well-respected public policy expert. He's a best-selling author and frequently shows up on Fox News and NBC and ABC, even CNN on the other side as a proponent of Tea Party politics. He's been explaining to us what the flat tax is and what it's all about. One of the complaints that people have is that in a flat tax system, and I think you touched on this, but I can still see it happening more, is that the richer people end up not paying as much tax in terms of a percentage of their earnings as the poorer people. Is it in fact a regressive tax?
I don't think so. I think in a lot of ways it's more progressive than our current code, perhaps not in the sense that the left here in the United States would think. But the fact of the matter is very wealthy people do not pay the same marginal rate that the rest of us do. They have an ability to move capital around. They have an ability to hire lawyers. And I remember famously John Kerry, who is a senator from Massachusetts and a very wealthy man, married to a very wealthy woman. His marginal tax rate was dramatically lower than those that might make $200,000 a year, and he's a multi-millionaire. Mm-hmm. And this is a classic example of what I'm talking about. There are wealthy people in every country in the world, including those with a marginal tax rate approaching 100%. And what do? They hide their wealth. What we would like to see is a simple, transparent code that encourages people to come back into the system, to repatriate, to focus on productive activity instead of the very unproductive activity of hiring tax lawyers and finding ways to get around the current code. And it's so complex today. Thousands and thousands of pages. It's a Byzantine maze that only the elite understand, and they know how to work that process. But the rest of us end up paying for that, what essentially is a version. It's a legalized tax evasion.
Well, the way politics work today, don't you think that even if there was a flat tax system, these people would still hire their fancy lawyers and find a system to pay less than their fair share?
Well, they would try, and everybody tries to do that, and there's nothing wrong with following the law as the law is written. But I think what in a real flat tax world, there's very little opportunity to evade paying your taxes. And frankly, very little incentive, because all those lawyers and all those special tax structures are very expensive too. And tax compliance is a net deadweight loss on society. And wouldn't you love to replace all of those tax lawyers with productive jobs, with wealth creation? That's what we're trying to get at.
I hear. Certainly there are countries in the world that have tried to adopt a flat tax system. Could you comment on them, as well as, I know that Romania, for example, was one of the classic adopters of the flat tax a few years ago, and now there's a lot of talk that they're feeling it didn't quite bring in enough revenue and they've got to switch back to a different system. How does that speak to what you're trying to do?
Well, I think politics strikes back when you do something so fundamental as this. And so far, based on my count, you have about 24 countries that have pursued some version of a flat tax, and not always. I mean, Hong Kong is a classic example, and the economic prosperity in Hong Kong is really It's so fundamentally different than what you see in virtually any other country in the world, because they've kept to that principle of not punishing capital, not punishing wealth creation. In Russia, they pursued a flat tax, and what it did was it generated more revenue, not less, because it encouraged people to stop evading the tax system.
So did people actually came back into the system?
People came back into the system, and it encouraged people to do so because it was a simple, flatter, lower rate than what it costs to stay in the black market. In all of these countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, where you've seen the flat tax implemented again and again and again, you saw a economic growth and an increase in revenue. Because understand how revenue is generated in a tax code is twofold. One, people have to pay in, and two, people pay more in if the economy is growing. And what the problem with very so-called progressive tax structures is that instead of people paying in, they find ways to not pay in because it's very expensive. Instead of investing in jobs and wealth creation, they hide their capital so that it can't be taxed. And what we saw in countries that embraced the flat tax was a dramatic improvement from where they were to where they got to. Now, this is not a magic elixir. A flat tax doesn't solve basic problems of corruption. It doesn't solve the lack of a rule of law. It doesn't solve regulatory burdens or even corruption of the money supply, which is creating a lot of the bubbles today. So you can't solve everything with a flat tax, but if you get your tax code right, I think you have a better chance of dealing with inflation, which is caused when governments print money they don't have to pay for spending they didn't have. If you have a steady flow of revenue coming into a country, you can really try to right-size the government to match that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it sounds very logical to me. We're just about out of time, but I'd like to ask you how people, for example, Warren Buffett, right, a wealthy and rather successful businessman in his own right, he seems to be quite on the other side of the coin from what you're suggesting. He's pro taxing the rich more, and he supports a death tax. How is it that he reads your stuff and doesn't quite see it this way?
Well, it's a bit of a mystery, and Bill Gates' dad is in the same camp with Warren Buffett. And I've always wondered, neither of these two gentlemen, who are extremely wealthy, have ever paid the same tax rate that the rest of us do. Because they do all these things that I'm talking about. They hide their wealth, they manipulate the code to minimize their tax burden. And if they feel so passionately about it, I would argue that the first thing they should do is pay their fair share. But what they don't seem to understand is the fact that a punitive tax code punishes people who want to get wealthy. It doesn't punish people that are wealthy, because the rich will always be rich, and there'll always be systems for people to protect their wealth once they get there. But how do you get there? That's what he would punish if he was able to pursue the policies that he's advocated.
I hear. Okay, we have been talking to Matt Kibbe, who's the president of FreedomWorks, which is an organization that, among other issues, talks a great deal about the importance of a flat tax. Matt, just in the last couple of seconds, could you please tell people how they could find out more of what you're doing and how they could follow your work?
Well, if you're interested in a flat tax, you should check out a website that we created called scrapthecode.org. And you can also find that link at our basic website, freedomworks.org.
Okay.
And freedomworks.org.
Okay. Matt Kibbe, thanks again very much for your time. I hope we'll get to speak to you again soon.
Thanks, Doug.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt show.